I'm going to be honest right from the start. I have no idea when I first started feeling this strange, simmering discontent. Maybe it was the night I realized Mark and I hadn't had a real conversation in weeks. Or maybe it was that subtle tension I noticed in the mirror every morning, like I was dissatisfied with my own reflection and projected it onto him. I can't pinpoint the moment I slid into this fault-finding version of myself, but I remember the exact night everything began to unravel. We were at home, which was typical for us, nursing glasses of wine in the living room. The lamp beside the couch cast an intimate glow, and normally I'd have found comfort in our little routine. But I couldn't relax. I kept noticing things about Mark that I'd never let bother me before. The way his t-shirt hung a little too snug around his stomach. The way he'd run a hand through his hair as if checking for something that wasn't there anymore. I remember thinking, does he not see how much he's changed? That irritating voice in my head, the one I hated, started churning up reasons to make a joke. And so, I went ahead and said something. Something small, a jab at his body, a playful comment that carried a sharp edge. I felt a jolt of power the instant the words left my mouth, like I'd regained some measure of control over my life by belittling him in that small way. And the weird thing is, I didn't even think it was a big deal at first. I mean, we're married, right? We tease each other. That's how it goes, or so I told myself. But the look in his eyes, the stiffness in his jaw, the quiet that fell between us, it was different than any silence I'd felt before. There was something about that silence that told me I had crossed a line. A responsible person would have apologized. A better wife would have seen the hurt in his eyes and tried to take it back. I just took another sip of wine and pretended it was no big deal, all while a tiny part of me was already scared of what it might mean. But that fear was buried under layers of denial, so I forced a laugh, and Mark sat there, not laughing at all. I remember trying to change the subject to something mundane, the groceries or the shape of tomorrow's schedule, just to fill the quiet. He barely responded. He seemed lost in some thought he didn't want to share, and I convinced myself he was simply overreacting. After all, I didn't mean to hurt him. It was just a remark. Except it wasn't just a remark, and I think deep down I knew it. I knew I'd said it out of spite for my own insecurities, but I wasn't ready to confront that. Not yet. I told myself this was just a little hiccup, that tomorrow we'd be laughing again, that relationships have these small moments of tension, and they blow over. But later that night I heard him sigh in a way I'd never heard before. A long, resigned exhale. And I got this rush of panic. I lay awake listening to him breathe, and I couldn't tell if he was asleep or lying there as awake as I was, feeling the first crack in whatever bond we still had. Something had shifted, and it scared me so badly that I shut my eyes, tried to sleep, and decided I'd just do better tomorrow, even though part of me suspected that wouldn't be enough. But deep down, I knew I was already losing him, and that thought made me angry, not at myself, but at him. I wish I had asked him then what was running through his head, but my pride wouldn't let me, and that pride was about to push us even further apart. I suppose the real problem wasn't that one remark, but the reason I felt the need to say it. It's not exactly easy to admit, but I'd been grappling with my own insecurities for months, maybe longer. I remember thinking, how could a single offhand comment feel like the beginning of the end? But it did, and the next day only confirmed it when he wouldn't meet my gaze at breakfast. And yet I still refused to accept that I was the villain of my own marriage story. I told myself he was sensitive, that he was blowing it out of proportion. If I just played it off and acted like everything was fine, maybe it would be. Maybe I wouldn't have to confront why I was so resentful in the first place. I'd noticed changes in myself, physical, emotional, and I blamed my stagnation on him, as if he were the reason I wasn't happy or satisfied or feeling beautiful anymore. Somehow it was simpler to poke at him than to face myself. It's embarrassing to lay it all out now, but I think I was afraid of turning into someone who just settled for a life that felt routine. In my mind, Mark had begun to represent everything I was scared of: complacency, predictability, time wearing away our best selves. Sometimes I'd look at him, his soft middle, the gentle roundness of his face, and I'd resent it, as if him changing physically was a betrayal of some unspoken promise we made to remain the same as the day we first said, "I love you." It's twisted, I know. But fear makes you see the people you love through a warped lens. So I teased him. I delivered these little jabs about what he ate or how he looked, always masked as harmless humor, and most of the time, he'd roll with it. Or he'd make an equally teasing remark about my obsessive need for order, or my endless attempts at new diets. We usually laughed and carried on, but there's a difference between playful teasing and humiliation that cuts too deep. I didn't realize how close I was skating to the edge each time. Or maybe I did and just didn't care. Looking back, I think part of me wanted a reaction. I wanted him to snap back, to prove he was still capable of fighting for me, for us, for himself. But he didn't. Instead, he got quieter. He retreated. And the more he retreated, the more jabs I threw, as if trying to smoke him out of that shell. It's painful to admit that I was using my words to force him into a confrontation. But that's exactly what I was doing. I was so convinced he needed to change, that he needed to be more driven, more passionate, more everything, and I refused to see that I was pushing him into a corner. He tried to talk to me. A few times, he'd start with something like, "Emily, I feel like you're not happy." And I'd brush it off, telling him I was just stressed, or maybe we needed a vacation, or that it was just a phase. But I never let him finish his thought. I was too busy trying to keep control of the narrative, too worried that listening to him might force me to face a truth I wasn't ready for. So I kept piling on the pressure, safe in the knowledge that he'd never leave. Because that's the thing. I was so certain he'd never walk away. I never stopped to think about what would happen if he did. There's a destructive arrogance in believing someone is bound to you no matter what you do or say. And that arrogance fueled my cruelty. He walked out of the room without a word, leaving me there with my hollow triumph. And something in my chest told me I'd just done real damage. I stood there, alone, trying to convince myself he was just being sensitive. But in truth, I felt a hint of panic. The panic of a child who knows she's gone too far but doesn't know how to undo it. When he finally came back, he didn't bring it up, and I was too much of a coward to apologize. In that moment, I could have bridged the gap. I can't call it anything else now but cruelty, even if I tried to disguise it as honesty or humor. Then came the moment, the one that sparked this avalanche. My words had always carried that subtle sting, but this time I sharpened them to an edge I'd never used before. And then I saw his face fall, heard his breath catch. I felt a little pang of regret right after I said it, but I was too proud to let it show. I could have acknowledged my wrongdoing. Instead, I turned on the TV and pretended everything was normal, ignoring the increasing tension that threatened to choke us both. And even then, I thought he'd never really do anything drastic. How little I knew him, or maybe how little I knew myself. All I knew was that the moment my eyes flicked to his face, something told me a storm was coming, and I didn't know if I had the courage to face it. But I still refused to back down, clinging to the last tattered shreds of my pride, as if that would protect me from the truth of what I'd started. The days that followed felt oddly hollow, as if our home had lost some essential warmth. I noticed he'd barely talk to me in the mornings. The small talk over coffee dwindled to polite nods and brief answers. Even the comfortable silence we once shared was replaced by a tense quiet that felt like an accusation. At first, I assumed he was just sulking. In my mind, he was giving me the cold shoulder to punish me for that one comment, and a part of me started to resent him for it. I made a show of maintaining our routines, thinking it would guilt him into returning to normal. But with every passing day, I could feel the gulf between us widening. I'd find myself overanalyzing the smallest details, like how he'd sit at the far end of the couch now, or how he'd linger in the shower longer than usual, like he didn't want to be around me. I told myself, he's acting so childish, even though part of me was worried. I started talking to my friends about it, framing the story in a way that made him seem overly sensitive. I said things like, yeah, I might have made a little joke about his love handles, but come on, it's not that serious. And they would laugh along, though a couple of them gave me looks that suggested maybe I was missing something. One friend asked, "Have you apologized?" And I balked at the question. The idea of apologizing felt too much like surrender, too much like admitting I was in the wrong and letting go of that tenuous feeling of control. So instead, I told her it wasn't really about the comment. It was more complicated. He'd been distant for a while. He was the one who needed to communicate better. Even as I spun that tale, I sensed how flimsy it sounded. But I kept spinning. If I could convince everyone around me that he was the problem, maybe I could convince myself too. Meanwhile, Mark was going through some transformation of his own. I noticed he started to exercise, quietly and without fanfare. He'd leave early in the mornings, dressed in sweatpants and a hoodie, and he'd come back sweaty and flushed. He never made a big deal out of it, never even told me he was hitting the gym, but the signs were obvious. New running shoes, a protein shake in the fridge, extra laundry. I found myself rolling my eyes, telling myself he was doing it just to spite me, to show me he could prove me wrong. I even joked to a friend, "Guess he's trying to get his revenge body." We both laughed. But there was this sinking feeling in my stomach that said maybe he was just trying to feel better about himself. Maybe he was finally fed up with my relentless teasing and decided to do something to regain control of his own life. That thought made me uneasy because it suggested that he was shifting, growing, and maybe I was the one standing still. So what did I do? I doubled down on the teasing. I let these little quips slip out like, "Don't strain yourself," or, "Wow, watch out, here comes the new Mark," dripping with mock enthusiasm. Every time I saw a flicker of hurt on his face, my chest tightened, but I brushed it off. I just didn't want him to see my own desperation. I was afraid that if he noticed how scared I was of losing him, he might realize he could do better. And so I pushed him away in 1,000 tiny ways, all while secretly hoping he'd turn around and fight back. But he never did. He just kept pushing forward with whatever new routine he had. He came home later and later, quietly letting me wonder where he was. I convinced myself he was punishing me, but the truth was simpler. He was living his life on his own terms now, and I was merely a bystander. Each day it felt like he slipped further out of my grasp, and I tried to pretend it didn't terrify me. And I wondered, was there a turning point approaching? Something told me that he was nearing a decision, and when he finally made it, I wouldn't like what it looked like. My stubborn pride was still in control, though, so I stayed in my lane, refusing to see the writing on the wall until it was too late. Eventually, the tension became impossible to ignore. It seeped into every aspect of our relationship. One night, though, I nearly broke. I was standing in the kitchen, staring at the sink full of dishes, and I just felt this overwhelming wave of regret. I'd spent so long harping on him for every little thing, his weight, his perceived laziness, that I never stopped to check what was happening inside me. I noticed how we didn't even text during the day anymore, and in the evenings, I found excuses to go to bed before him, or he'd fall asleep on the couch, as if we couldn't bear to be alone in the same bed. My emotions were a tangled mess of fear, anger, and a strange sort of longing. I wanted him to hold me and tell me everything would be all right, but I'd been the one pushing him away. And because my pride was still in the driver's seat, I kept up the front. Why was I so unhappy? Why was I so quick to lash out at him? I remember gripping the edge of the counter and breathing hard, on the verge of tears, and I half hoped he'd walk in and see me, ask me what was wrong. But he didn't come. I ended up washing those dishes alone, scrubbing them like I was trying to purge my own guilt. By the time I was done, my hands were pruned, and my anger was simmering again, directed at him for not magically knowing I needed him in that moment. It's twisted, right? How you can sabotage yourself and then blame someone else for not saving you. The more I think about it, the more I realize how blind I was to his side of the story. I didn't consider how the constant jabs might have chipped away at his confidence, his sense of security. I didn't think about how humiliating it must have felt to be reduced to a single characteristic, his body, by the person who was supposed to love him unconditionally. But in my head, I painted him as the antagonist for not reassuring me or chasing me or doing something to prove I was worth fighting for. So I let the resentment simmer, all the while telling myself I just wanted him to stand up for himself. It's horrifying to look back and see how I twisted my own desires. I mocked him for not being assertive, hoping he'd push back. And when he didn't, I just mocked him more. Every insecure thought I had about myself, my own aging, my own body issues, my fear of a stagnant life, manifested in my words to him. And I believed, foolishly, that it was on him to fix things by changing, by becoming the man I wanted him to be, rather than the man he was comfortable being. Every day I'd watch him quietly go about his new routines, and each time I felt a pang of something that might have been jealousy, or admiration, or fear. He was becoming someone else, bit by bit, and I was standing on the sidelines, refusing to cheer him on or join him. I was stuck in my narrative that he was the problem, and I wasn't ready to see the truth. By then, I should have known a confrontation was inevitable. There's only so much one person can take. And the night it all came crashing down, I can't even say I was surprised. It felt like a storm I'd been summoning for months. And the moment his voice cut through the silence, telling me exactly how he felt, I realized I wasn't prepared at all for the consequences of the monster I'd unleashed. He called me out in the gentlest, firmest tone I'd ever heard from him. We were in the living room, and I was flipping through channels, not really watching anything, just running from the quiet. He walked in, stood there for a moment, and then he said my name. I recall how the air felt heavier, how the lights seemed dimmer, how my chest felt tight with dread. It was like that calm before the thunder rips the sky open. In a twisted way, I almost welcomed it, thinking maybe after the confrontation we'd find a way to piece ourselves back together. But I had no idea how complete the break would be. It caught my attention because he rarely used that voice, the one that wasn't angry, but was filled with a certain finality. I turned the TV off, and there was no background noise, just the hum of tension. He started by saying he was tired of feeling like he had to shrink himself to make room for my insecurities. He said my constant remarks about his body had chipped away at him, and even though he tried to brush them off, the fact that it came from me, the person he trusted the most, made every word land like a punch. His eyes were steady, and I remember feeling this urge to make a joke, to deflect, but the look on his face told me it wasn't going to work this time. Instead, I started to say something defensive, something along the lines of, I was just teasing. But he cut me off, not rudely, but with a determined calm I'd never witnessed before. He said he knew the difference between gentle teasing and real contempt. And I felt my heart tighten because I realized he'd seen right through me. He'd known all along what was driving my comments. He must have seen my own insecurities and anger, and maybe he'd hoped I'd come to terms with them on my own. But I hadn't, and now he was the one taking control. There was a moment of silence, thick with the weight of all the times we should have talked honestly, but didn't. Then he dropped the words that stung the most. "You don't respect me." I tried to protest, to say that of course I loved and respected him, but even as the words formed, they felt hollow. Because it wasn't about love, was it? It was about respect, and the way I casually undermined him at every turn. He told me he deserved better, that he deserved to feel valued by the person he chose to spend his life with. and that if I couldn't offer that, if I was going to keep tearing him down to build myself up, then he couldn't stay. I felt my chest clench as those words hung in the air. He couldn't stay. This was the scenario I secretly dreaded, but convinced myself would never happen. My voice trembled when I asked what he meant. He looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resolve, and he told me he'd already found a place to stay for a while, that he needed space to figure out whether we could move past this, or if this was the final fracture. It was as if the floor dropped out from under me. My first instinct was to lash out, call him dramatic, accuse him of overreacting. In fact, I might have raised my voice, asked him how he could do this after all these years. I demanded to know if he even cared about me, about us. And in the midst of my shouting, I realized I was crying. My tears were fueled by fear, anger, and something else. Regret, I think, for letting it come to this. He didn't raise his voice back, just repeated that he couldn't keep feeling small in his own marriage. I tried one last tactic. I told him if he left, I'd never forgive him. But he gave me this look that said forgiveness was beside the point. He walked to the bedroom, grabbed a duffel bag, and filled it calmly. I followed him around, half sobbing, half raging, insisting I was sorry, even though I never actually said the words. My pride and my desperation clashed in the most humiliating way, and by the time he was at the door, I was practically begging him to stay. He paused, looked at me, and said softly, "You mocked me for too long, and I won't allow it anymore." Then he left, and I heard the door click behind him. The silence in the apartment was suffocating. I sank onto the couch and stared at the spot where he'd just been standing, my mind whirling. Part of me still couldn't believe he'd actually walked away. Part of me wanted to scream that it was unfair. But a little voice inside me whispered, "What did you expect?" That night, I didn't sleep at all, haunted by the image of his steady gaze and the echo of that door closing. I realized with horrifying clarity that my words had real power, and I'd used them to destroy the safest thing I ever had. The question was whether that destruction was permanent, and I didn't have an answer, only a gnawing fear that I'd gone too far to take it back. The aftermath of his leaving was so much worse than I imagined. Waking up in an empty bed, realizing he wouldn't be there to make coffee, seeing the absence of his shoes by the door, these small details cut deeper than I thought they could. I felt embarrassed telling people he'd left, so I tried to cover it up. I even told my family he was on a business trip, though Mark rarely traveled for work. But I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened, because that would involve admitting how terribly I'd behaved. Each day passed in a blur of self-recrimination and anger. One moment, I'd be livid at him for abandoning me, for not giving me a chance to fix things. The next, I'd be curled up on the couch, tears streaming down my face as I accepted that I'd pushed him away. Eventually, though, reality seeped in and forced me to see my part in it. I had time, far too much time, to replay our interactions and dissect every careless joke, every time I'd brushed off his hurt feelings. I remembered the look in his eyes when I'd ridicule his appearance in that casual, offhand way, as if it were no big deal. Suddenly I understood the magnitude of my words, and how they must have made him feel. Unwanted, disrespected, maybe even unloved. And the truth was, it wasn't about him at all. It was about me. I hated parts of myself, and instead of dealing with that, I'd weaponized my words against him. It's a cruel twist. I told myself I was bored, that he was too predictable, that he needed to change, when in fact, I was the one stuck in a toxic loop. Realizing this didn't magically fix anything, though. I still had no idea where to find him, or if I should even try to see him. Every time I picked up my phone to call, I'd panic, wondering if he'd even answer. Then I'd think, he's the one who left, so he should be the one to reach out. And I'd end up tossing the phone aside, stewing in resentment. Meanwhile, I saw clues of his new life on social media. A mutual friend posted a group photo, and there he was, looking lighter somehow. He'd lost a little weight, and his posture seemed more confident. I felt a lump in my throat when I saw him smiling like that, surrounded by people I didn't know. A pang of jealousy, confusion, and longing hit me all at once. Was he happier without me? Had he found a circle that appreciated him more than I ever did? Instead of celebrating his apparent progress, I resented it, at least initially. But then a different perspective started creeping in. Maybe he was finally feeling good about himself, freed from my relentless criticism. That realization was like a punch to the gut. So I tried to reflect on what brought me to this point. I thought about my childhood, about how my parents used to argue with harsh words that never seemed to heal. I thought about my fear of being ordinary, how I'd latched onto Mark as some symbol of security, and then blamed him when I felt stuck. All these reflections didn't give me a clear path forward, but they chipped away at my denial. I started to see that if I ever wanted to salvage anything, whether with Mark or just with myself, I had to confront these demons. So I mustered the courage to call a therapist. I told her a watered-down version of events, but even that made me realize how ridiculous I sounded, blaming him for leaving when I'd effectively driven him out. The therapist asked me what I'd do if he never came back, and the question left me speechless. Until that moment, I'd been assuming there would be a reconciliation, that once we cooled off, we'd talk, maybe argue, and then make up. But the question made me face the possibility that he might have truly moved on. That line of thinking terrified me, but also galvanized me into taking real stock of my life. I started to keep a journal, writing down the moments I felt insecure or angry, trying to trace their origins. It was a messy, uncomfortable process, but it felt like the only way to claw my way out of the spiral I'd created. Still, at night, I lay in bed, wondering if he was lying awake somewhere too, or if he was sleeping peacefully, relieved to be free from the weight of my constant derision. Each day felt like a step closer to understanding myself, but also a step further from him, and that contradiction left me feeling utterly lost. I had to face the likelihood that he might not return, and that any closure I sought might have to come from inside me. But every time I tried, the words got stuck, and I told myself it was too late anyway. Besides, would he even believe me now? I'd like to say that clarity came in a dramatic flash, but it was more like a slow burn of understanding that one day, this was all a result of choices. My choices. It hit me when I was at a grocery store, of all places. I was pushing a cart down the produce aisle, and I saw this couple laughing together as they picked out fruits. Yet the thought of never seeing him walk through our door again kept me awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying our last conversation over and over. At one point, I found myself holding on to one of his shirts he'd left behind, pressing it to my face, inhaling the faint smell of him. I felt desperate, ashamed, and heartbreakingly alone. Was this the price of my pride? I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him I was sorry. Something about their easy closeness made my throat tighten. I thought about how Mark and I used to stroll through aisles, occasionally tossing silly things in the cart, teasing each other in a playful way. That memory felt both warm and painfully distant. Right there in the aisle, it sank in. I'd taken something beautiful and turned it sour, and I had no one to blame but myself. After that, I started gathering the courage to call him, actually dial his number. But then a wave of panic would stop me, because what if he didn't answer? Or worse, what if he did, and I heard someone else in the background? Or he'd be polite but distant, confirming that we'd truly drifted too far apart. My fear of rejection was paralyzing, the same fear that had fueled my nasty behavior in the first place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do something. Say something. So I drafted countless text messages on my phone, paragraphs of apologies and explanations, but I never sent them. Each time I felt like the words were too little, too late, or too self-serving. It was only when my therapist pressed me to take a tangible step toward repair that I decided on writing a letter to him. I poured out everything on paper: the fear, the anger, the self-loathing, the regrets. I acknowledged the harm I'd done and admitted that I understood why he left. I remember walking out of there feeling like I'd crossed some threshold. I had taken responsibility, in writing, for what I'd done. Now I just had to live with the consequences. A strange calm settled over me in the days that followed, like I'd done the one thing I could to reach out, and the rest was out of my hands. Still, I missed him painfully. The house felt cavernous, every room echoing with memories. At night, I'd linger in the living room, half expecting him to walk in. And at the end, I told him I'd respect whatever decision he made, even if that meant never coming back. Writing it was cathartic, but I hesitated for days before mailing it. Somehow it felt more permanent than a text or email. I was terrified he'd read it and feel nothing, or that he'd tear it up, or that he wouldn't read it at all. Eventually, though, I found myself at the post office, dropping it into the slot, my heart hammering in my chest. I even caught myself cooking meals for 2 out of sheer habit. But each morning, I woke up alone, reminded that this was my new reality, one I'd created with my own words. And as lonely as it was, I began to realize I didn't want to be the person I'd been before. I started reading books about self-esteem, about relationships, about healing. I meditated, which I'd always scoffed at. I forced myself to confront the ugly parts of my personality. It wasn't pretty, but there was a grim satisfaction in knowing I was finally doing something other than tearing down the person I was supposed to love. The question that haunted me was whether Mark would ever witness these changes, or if this was all just for me now. A month passed before I heard from him. I almost jumped out of my skin when I saw his name flash on my phone screen. But when I answered, his voice was calm, maybe a little guarded. He thanked me for the letter, said he appreciated it. My heart soared and crashed in the same instant because his tone gave nothing away. I wanted to ask if he was coming home, but I swallowed the urge. Instead, I mumbled something about being sorry, and he said he knew. Then he said he needed more time. He needed to figure out if he could trust me again, trust that I wouldn't revert to mocking him every time I felt insecure. I blinked back tears, told him I understood, and we ended the call. I stared at my phone, wishing he'd said something more final, whether it was goodbye or come back. The ambiguity was torture, but it was also honest. He didn't know yet, and maybe neither did I. Was I really ready to change? Or was I clinging to the idea of us because I couldn't stand the shame of losing him for good? The weeks that followed felt like a test of my resolve. I carried on with therapy, poured myself into journaling, trying to figure out who I was without Mark constantly in the background. I struggled with the emptiness, but I also found these tiny sparks of self-discovery. I realized how many of my jokes at his expense had really been disguised attacks on my own sense of worth. I recognized how I'd conflated his body, changing with my own fear of time passing and dreams unfulfilled. Instead of dealing with my disappointment in myself, I'd externalized it onto him. That was a painful realization, but also liberating in a sense. I couldn't fix what I didn't acknowledge, and now I was finally acknowledging it. Meanwhile, I tried to stay open to the possibility that Mark might reach out again. Sometimes, in a moment of weakness, I'd message him something innocuous like, "How are you?" or send a meme I thought he'd find funny. Sometimes he'd respond with a polite, "I'm good," or a quick, "haha." But the conversation never went deeper. It was clear he was still guarding his heart. One night, though, he called me unexpectedly. My pulse spiked the moment I saw his name on the screen. I answered, my voice trembling with a mix of hope and dread. He told me he'd been doing a lot of thinking, too. Said he was learning to value himself again, and that meant he couldn't be around someone who made him feel small, even if that person was me. I felt a flood of tears sting my eyes. He continued, explaining that while he appreciated my letter and could see I was making changes, he didn't want to come back to the same dynamic we had before. If we were ever going to try again, we both needed to be different people. I told him I understood, and I meant it. But part of me also panicked. It was more like a precarious footbridge over a deep chasm, and we both had to decide if we trusted it enough to meet in the middle. Days later, I found myself sitting in the living room, looking at old pictures of us, feeling this wistful ache. I flashed back to the early years, when the very things I now criticized about him were the things I found endearing. His quiet nature, his contentment in the small pleasures of life. Different how? Could I undo the damage I'd done? Could I become the partner he deserved? Or was this just a band-aid on a wound too deep to heal? We talked for a while, and for the first time in months, it felt like a real conversation. Honest, raw, and painfully vulnerable. When we hung up, I felt simultaneously closer to him and more uncertain than ever. This was not a fairy tale path to reconciliation. I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd twisted those qualities into flaws, simply because I was discontent with my own life and needed someone else to blame. It struck me just how unbalanced and unfair I'd been, and I wondered if I'd lost forever the chance to share those small pleasures with him again. Still, a small part of me felt hope. Maybe it was foolish, but I believed that if I kept working on myself, if I gave him the space he needed, there might still be a future for us. Not the old version of us, but something new, built on mutual respect instead of my incessant critique. The real test would be whether I could maintain this self-awareness once the immediate crisis passed. Would I slip back into old habits, or could I genuinely learn to handle my insecurities without lashing out? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but it also motivated me. I couldn't control whether Mark came back, but I could control whether I became someone who was worth coming back to. So I kept going to therapy, kept journaling, kept reading about emotional resilience. I practiced calling out my own negative thoughts before they became snide comments. And every day, I thought about how it might feel to look him in the eyes, truly see him, and say something kind instead of something cruel. That vision guided me in a way I hadn't experienced before. But even then, I couldn't help wondering if it was already too late. The final question that lingered in my mind was this: even if he returned, would he ever fully trust that I wouldn't tear him down again when my insecurities flared up? I had no definitive answer. All I knew was that I had a choice: keep moving forward or sink back into denial. For once, I chose to move forward, uncertain if he'd be beside me or not. I can't pretend there's a neat resolution. Months have passed, and as I sit here, I still don't know exactly what the future holds for us. We've had a few more conversations, each carefully navigated, as if we're both afraid to say too much or too little. He sounds guarded, but not hostile. He told me he's been working on his own feelings, addressing the hurt and anger. I confessed that I'm in therapy, trying to understand why I turned so harsh, and he said he was glad I was finally taking it seriously. That small acknowledgement felt like a lifeline, but it was tempered by the realization that we're still miles apart, both literally and metaphorically. I've come to accept that this healing, if it can even be called that, isn't about snapping our fingers and returning to the way things were. Frankly, I don't want to return to the old way. That dynamic was poisoned by my arrogance and his reluctance to stand up for himself. So now we're both forging these new identities, uncertain if they'll fit together in the end. Sometimes I imagine a conversation months or years from now, where we sit down to dinner and laugh about some inside joke. In my mind, we share a look of mutual understanding, a silent promise never to take each other for granted again. But it's just a daydream, and I'm careful not to hinge all my hopes on it, because the truth is, I might have lost him for good. If that's the case, then this journey is about becoming a better version of myself, one that won't hurt the people I care about the way I hurt him. I think about the woman I was, so blinded by my own fears and resentment that I thought mocking someone's body was a harmless outlet. It's appalling to me now. I see it for what it was, a desperate act of self-protection that ended up destroying the very security I sought. At times, I'm consumed by regret, wishing I could rewind to that night and hold my tongue. But all I can do is move forward. Occasionally, I receive a text from Mark. Sometimes it's about a financial matter or a practical concern, but every so often, it's a little more personal. He'll ask how I'm doing, if I'm still seeing the therapist, or he'll share a bit about his own journey. Those moments feel like tiny windows of hope, offering a glimpse of what might be possible if we both keep growing. Yet, I'm learning not to pin all my progress on the chance of reconciliation. If I continue to see him as the solution to my problems, I'll just fall back into the same destructive patterns. It has to be enough that I'm changing for myself. Whether that eventually brings us together or not remains to be seen. I haven't asked him outright if he's seeing anyone else, partly because I'm too afraid of the answer, and partly because I know it's none of my business right now. He has the right to find happiness wherever he can, and if it's not with me, that's a consequence I have to accept. So I focus on what I can control, which is my own behavior, my own capacity to grow. Still, every time I hear a key in the door, I experience this jolt, hoping it's him coming back. And every time, it's just me, or the silence echoing in the hallway. I'm learning to live with that silence, to find a sort of solace in my own space, to fill it with healthier thoughts and habits. The question that keeps me up at night, though, is whether I've truly changed or just learned to mask my tendencies. What if we do reunite, and in a moment of weakness, I let a mocking remark slip out again? Will all this progress collapse like a house of cards? That uncertainty is part of the price I pay, but I try not to let it paralyze me anymore. Instead, I use it as motivation to keep working, to keep being mindful of my words and intentions. So here I am, alone in our apartment, surrounded by memories that are both comforting and painful. I don't know if he'll walk through that door again in the future. I don't know if we'll rebuild a love that's stronger than before. All I know is I stand at a crossroads with an open wound and the possibility of healing. It's humbling and terrifying, and at the end of the day, it's my choice whether I make something better out of this or let it break me forever. For now, I'm choosing to try, even if I can't see past the next step. Maybe that's what hope is, moving forward without certainty, trusting that change is possible even if you don't have any guarantees. And as I set down this pen, or close this journal, that question lingers. If he does come back, will I be the person he needs me to be, or am I doomed to repeat the same mistakes? The answer is still out there, waiting on the other side of this silence that fills our once shared home. Maybe one day we'll find out together, or maybe I'll have to face it alone. I'm not sure, but this is where I am, balancing between regret and the faint light of a new beginning, uncertain whether to reach for it or recoil, because there's no guarantee it'll stay in my grasp if I do, and that's the hardest truth of all.